Tonight on Headline Humboldt, as our region faces the combined threats of climate change and looming earthquakes, Humboldt State University steps into the breach to study these threats and prepare us all for what's coming. Also, a recent protest to protect women's reproductive rights and work toward a more equitable America led scores of locals to gather in front of the Humboldt County Courthouse, demanding progress. Coming up next. Humboldt, I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Every once in a while, the constellations align deep within the cosmos, and we're handed a show here on Headline Humboldt that seems to center on one theme or subject of great local interest. Tonight is such an evening. If you hear nothing else tonight, hear this. Humboldt County and the North Coast generally are much like the rest of the world in staring down the barrel of a climate emergency. We're like the rest of the world, yes, but we're also likely to face more severe repercussions sooner due to our degraded infrastructure and the impact sea level rise in particular will have on a significant portion of our low-lying communities. Fire has also proven to be a major risk on the North Coast, and those combined threats seem only likely to get worse as the area heats up and dries out. We've known all this for a while, and experts in the field, like Alderman Laird, have been briefing area officials for years now, trying to raise awareness and plan for the inevitable impacts. Tonight, that significant local concern is made evident by two recent news events that highlight the issue and some of the steps being taken to address it. State Senator Mike McGuire held a town hall meeting this week with climate experts to explore the problem and find possible solutions. It was a detailed and wide-ranging presentation that offered both a review of the issues and a glimpse of some solutions. We'll have testimony from that event tonight. But perhaps more importantly, Humboldt State University is embarking on a multi-year collaboration with the University of Washington and Oregon State University to examine precisely how climate change and geology will impact the future here on the North Coast. On this ragged edge of North America where the bedrock crumbles into the ocean, we're forever surfing the whims of tectonic plates. History tells us quite clearly that major earthquake events loom, as always, in our future. And while we understand the risk, we're also in desperate need of more information. So as part of this project, funded by the National Science Foundation, HSU has taken up the challenge on both fronts, climate and the unsettled planet. We're certainly not doomed, but the next several decades seem likely to offer hazards beyond our current levels of understanding. The best way to stave off disaster is to prepare as well as we can and learn what to actually expect when all these looming threats materialize. Now the interview. HSU Assistant Professor Jennifer Marlow and Dean Eric Riggs from HSU's College of Natural Resources and Sciences recently joined us over the World Wide Web and described the work they'll perform. They detail what the partnership means to this area and how it will work.
The Coastlines and Peoples Research Hub is a project that will involve HSU along with Oregon State University and the University of Washington as institutions collaborating with NGOs, government agencies, and coastal communities to examine the risks to our Pacific Northwest coastline, including acute hazards such as tectonic action, tsunami run-up, and chronic hazards, including sea level rise and erosion. And the call for this project really came from the communities themselves that were requesting a coordinated agenda among researchers and scientists so that communities could have more say and more influence over how and what science is done, and also over how science is used to inform decision-making about risk and disaster risk reduction on the coastlines.
Excellent. We also have with us Dean Eric Riggs from the College of Natural Resources and Sciences. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. It's our pleasure. So can you describe a little bit about, how is this an ideal partnership for HSU, both from where it's been historically and where it's about to go in terms of, its future evolution?
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of where the university has been, this institution, especially our college, has always been relatively interdisciplinary. Looking at the intersections between science and society and how scientific advances really play out in a social context. And so that's one of the strengths of the whole university, is the strength of the college. And certainly as we move forward to become California's third polytechnic institution, that also takes on something of a workforce dimension, more so than already exists. And that involves partnerships with all kinds of communities more explicitly, and industry partners as well. All kinds of local engagement across the board really is the characteristic of that, plus preparing people to work in the region. Partnering with other institutions, in this case, the two other partner universities in this project, is also a natural outgrowth of this, but frankly also rests in the historical roots of this institution, having a far greater research enterprise than most California State University schools, and certainly most of the size of Humboldt State University. This university distinguishes itself from not only having an excellent undergraduate set of programs, but also researchers that are engaged at a national and international level. And so that sets us up as a fantastic regional partner for a project of this sort of scale and local application with a global view of internationally relevant results. So I think we're just right at the middle of a perfect spot for this project.
Absolutely. Jennifer, you talked about a lot of different threads within what's going to be studied by this. What are the particular risks facing our region? I mean, people talk about climate change and sea level rise eventually for Humboldt Bay and the Bay Area, and also the Cascadia subduction zone, which is a huge fault line. Can you talk about how us in particular are under siege by those threats and how this might help?
Sure. So there's a complex layer of risks that our region faces. There's obviously the Cascadia subduction zone, which subjects us to earthquakes and acute shaking and tsunamis, along with longer ongoing changes like sea level rise and coastal erosion, which will take place over a different time scale, a different timeline. So we're looking at changes that could be experienced in a minute and changes that will be experienced for millennia. So we have a vast diversity of potential changes that are very specific to Humboldt Bay. For example, relative sea level rise here is the fastest on the West Coast. So in particular, Humboldt Bay is going to be needing to adapt to rising sea levels. Its coastal infrastructure, its shorelines, its communities will have to coordinate over what our future looks like and how it integrates adaptation and resilience to these unprecedented levels of change.
So is the benefit going to primarily be in planning and responding to build resiliency?
Across the board, I would say the science, there's a team on this NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant, that's very much focused on the tectonic activities and tectonic risks. There's another team looking more at the climate risks, the sea level rise and ongoing chronic changes. And then there's a team which Dr. Lori Richmond and I from HSU are on, which is looking at community adaptation and community adaptive capacity to both of these types of risks. So it certainly is an interdisciplinary approach looking at how community perceptions of risk inform the science and how the science can inform governance and decision-making and even engineering as we try to coordinate plans across institutions, state lines, disciplines. It's a very 21st century problem.
Absolutely. Dean Riggs, we've mentioned several times already the Cascadia subduction zone. I mean, a lot of people here are familiar. We've seen the articles that come out, and we're all anxious because that 300-year period is about up, I think, from what we've heard. But could you explain for us real quick, as a geologist yourself, what that is and how we are sort of in the heart of where we're expecting maybe some action on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Earth's surface is divided into a set of rigid plates in the upper layers of the crust. And there are places where those slide side by side, like farther south in California in the San Andreas Fault Zone. And there are places where things come apart, like in the middle of the many of the ocean basins. And then there are places where these plates will come together. And that's what's happening along the Cascadia subduction zone. The process of one plate sinking under another one is called subduction. Mm-hmm. And there are two plates offshore, the Gorda Plate and the Pacific Plate farther north, that are basically going underneath North America. And that's what generates a very active seismic zone offshore, and also generates the volcanic chains that are inland as material gets deep enough into the earth and some parts of it start to induce melting. So the seismic risk, we can't do anything about it. The plates will keep moving. We can only plan for it. We also can understand the dynamics of how those systems respond. And we do know, like you mentioned, this 300-year interval. The last time this system ruptured was 1700 in January, I think, is when we've been able to pin it down. Wow. And so, there's no shot clock in the sense of, oh, it must happen on a regular basis. But we know as a long-running statistical average that, the faults tend to settle into a frequency. And so we are right to be concerned along the entire Pacific Northwest margin about the behavior of Cascadia, because the evidence also seems to suggest that when parts of it rupture, the whole thing has a tendency to come a bit unglued. And so you get fairly large earthquake potentials, at least in the region. So from a shaking perspective, that's important. From the sudden movement of large amounts of seawater generates tsunamis as those waves impinge on shore. And so, this region faces a relatively rare on the human time scale, but relatively major impact as these events come on in. And so the best way to get around it is planning, understanding the frequency, understanding the impact, and then understanding how communities can be resilient against in the face of these hazards.
Yeah. The other issue that seems to be coming up a lot is sea level rise. I'm not sure who's best to answer this, but what is the Sea Level Rise initiative from HSU, and how does that tie into this?
Sure, I can answer that. So the Sea Level Rise initiative is a group of community members, tribal members, faculty, local government agency, staff working together to understand, inform, and support Humboldt-based specific sea level rise planning. So there's efforts going on. A young master's student is currently working on how to support more government coordination at the local level. I'm working on a different funded project looking at potential risk to a spent nuclear fuel site on Humboldt Bay as a result of potential sea level rise and bluff inundation. There are faculty also working on several other projects looking at how to engage the community in sea level rise planning so that it's not a one directional topic, that it's influenced and driven by the priorities of the local region. So the Humboldt Bay Sea Level Rise Initiative is chaired by Dr. Lori Richmond, my collaborator on this NSF grant. And we're hoping that it can be a landing pad for researchers, not only from Humboldt Bay region, but from, say, UW or OSU or other institutions to do work, but do it in a way that's in collaboration and very much informed by locally driven interests.
So now you mentioned that this is a grant and it comes to the National Science Foundation. You applied for that grant with the partnership of OSU and University of Washington. Is that how it worked?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And so there's 18.9 million total. Is that what the total is? How does that break down? I mean, is it just basically per subject area and the universities will tap in as they need it? Do you have any idea of how much of that HSU may use for research, anything like that?
Sure. Yeah. And it's a 5-year funded grant. So it's not an annual expenditure of $18 million. It's over 5 years. HSU will be entitled to about $450,000 of it. The majority is split between Oregon and University of Washington, but there are other partners, and some of the funds are going to support involvement from underrepresented students to support young scientists that are growing and developing in their careers so that they may be involved in this type of interdisciplinary science that's driving governance and decision-making around coastal resilience. It's very much divided to support community engagement and to help compensate community partners that will be part of the research and that will be co-producing the research with the researchers.
Yeah. Dean Riggs, you mentioned it a little bit before, and then also Jennifer, you just mentioned it, but the press release that was sent out that announced this talked about equity and efforts to make sure that underrepresented groups are not unfairly impacted by these types of events. How is this particular project going to minimize those differentials? And do you have any idea what the actual mechanisms might be?
Well, there's a few. I mean, from the university perspective, the student engagement is probably our biggest lever in terms of where we can have a direct impact. HSU already brings in a substantial number of first-time in college students. We have very robust representation of minority or traditionally underrepresented student groups on this campus in the College of Natural Resources and Sciences, more so than most scientific educational institutions. And so we are starting from a place of strength there, but I think then also the really sincere and long running and always improving community relations with many of the tribal nations and then other communities, both impacted by economic disparity or other kinds of factors along the coast. So it's one of those places where we engage directly and frequently. I think just from a sign, and this is really more Jennifer's space anyway, and Lori's, but I mean, many communities that are disadvantaged in any kind of way or are in a very vulnerable position are often on the front lines, unfortunately, of receiving damage from disasters like you're talking about, in terms of being in more marginal coastal properties or in places that are more exposed. And so that's another way to sort of magnify some of the community impact, is to focus the research on areas of greatest need and greatest vulnerability.
Jennifer, do you have a comment on that?
Sure. I think another aspect, in addition to all of the comments that Dean Riggs just shared, another aspect of that is looking at governance and looking at how many underrepresented people are involved in governance or governance level decision making. And so part of this research is also to look at how to build adaptive capacity of underrepresented groups to be not just advisors, but decision makers and leaders in this space. So part of the grant will fund a program called the Coastal Leadership Institute, which will help educate and train and build leadership capacity and network among disadvantaged groups, so that they're in decision-making positions that will affect ultimately the future decisions about how to help coastal communities adapt and become more resilient to these impacts.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we've all been witness to over the last several years is that there's been a lot of talk about climate change and not as much action as is obviously required. I mean, sort of a ground level question I have for you guys is, I mean, from your perspective and from your expertise, are we at the point where we can really make a difference at this point with minimizing sea level rise or climate, impacts, or has that train left the station? I mean, at what point is this going to be a diminishing returns kind of situation?
From my perspective, I can't be hopeless on that. I think, as a scientist and an educator at the helm of this college, I have to say that our people are really engaged in trying to find solutions to minimize the impact that humanity has as we go forward and develop as a species together, but then also to mitigate the train that has left the station. There's no doubt the train has left the station, but not all of the train has left the station, and we don't have to let the rest of the train leave the station. There are still huge advances to be made in sustainable energy, in responsible coastal development, in mitigating and understanding sea level rise, and dealing with shifting climate and growing patterns, fire issues, and obviously up here in Northern California is a huge issue. And so we have people on our campus and in this college studying fire science and how to manage what is the future of forests going to look like in this area. So I think you have to do both. I mean, it's not just an either or. Absolutely.
Jennifer?
I think that the transition has to be just and equitable, and it has to engage those most affected for it to be actually meaningful. I think there's certainly ways that we need to adapt to the changes. As we know, there's some we've locked in, and there's lots of work to do there. And there's lots of need to have that be informed by science, but also driven by community values, community interests. We're trying to build the world we want to live in. How do we do that in a way that actually can speak to people's aspirations about who they want to be, what coastal communities want to become, how do they participate in those decisions? And through this climate change dilemma, it offers that opportunity to really shape the future. And so I think it's a really incredible exercise in exercising our own outlook on the world and making ourselves part of it. We've already clearly created this problem, so we have to be part of the solution.
Absolutely. That's pretty much all I had for you. Is there anything that you guys would like to add that I missed and lamely didn't ask the right questions?
You covered a lot of the key issues. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with your viewers and the opportunity to join you.
No, thank you guys so much. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Thank you so much for your interest in the project.
Yeah, and come back. Once this is underway and things are happening, we'd be happy to feature any aspect of it that you think deserves more attention.
Great, and we will post updates on the Humboldt Sea Level Rise Initiative website, so interested listeners can go to that site and be connected with the research. And also the NSF grant offers seminars for interested people that want to learn about what is happening and what the researchers and community members are working on. So that's another place for people to engage. And that link will be on the Sea Level Rise Initiative website as well.
Thanks for joining us, and we appreciate you having you on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, James.
As I mentioned, many locals are quite aware of our climate challenges and are already taking steps to get us prepared. State Senator Mike McGuire joined with several experts this week to host a town hall meeting on the very subject.
The alarm could not be louder. Climate change is here. The evidence is clear, and the impacts are dangerous. Experts believe that climate change has made California and the American West warmer and drier over the last 20 to 30 years. Extreme heat is now the top weather-related killer in the United States. Western states are now more susceptible to extreme drought and larger, more destructive and more frequent wildfires. Our coastal communities are already experiencing early challenges with sea level rise. And we know that California's climate has always been variable, but those last couple of decades have been some of the hottest on record here in the Golden State. And I firmly believe that there are solutions, but it's going to take all of us working together, advancing bold solutions to the most pressing challenge, and that's our climate crisis. And that's why the legislature here in California just acted. We approved the single largest investment in climate action in the history of the Golden State. Over $15 billion in funding to tackle the growing wildfire crisis in the state was allocated. We'll be investing in drought response and resiliency, helping communities prepare for extreme heat and sea level rise. And we're advancing funding for more sustainable agricultural practices. This investment is truly a nation-leading climate package. And while Californians have historically led this nation on emission reduction efforts, now more than ever, we have to redouble our focus to combat this growing crisis.
Christina Dahl, senior climate scientist for the Union of Concerned Scientists, explained how much of what we're seeing on the news right now in terms of human suffering is a direct result of a changing global climate.
For many of us in California, wildfires and drought weigh very heavily on our minds. And certainly the things that Daniel was just talking about are things that we are all concerned about. Will we have enough water? Will our forests be intact? Will they be burning? And part of the reason these weigh so heavily on us is for a very good reason, right? They're images that we see every year of people's homes being reduced to ash, dozens of people being rescued from an area that's quickly become overwhelmed with flames, or cars jamming a one-lane road trying to get out as flames are licking at their car doors. But as we grapple with this particular manifestation of climate change, people in states far from California are battling with different, but in many cases equally harrowing manifestations of our changing climate. So I want to bring your mind back to just 5 weeks ago. On August 29th, Hurricane Ida made landfall on the coast of Louisiana, and it was bearing many of the fingerprints of climate change. The storm had just undergone a rapid intensification, going from a Category 1 hurricane to a Category 4 hurricane in about 24 hours, which is something that more and more hurricanes are doing as our climate warms. The storm had drawn strength from the abnormally warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, which were made warmer by climate change. And the storm surge associated with the hurricane was deeper and farther reaching because the sea level is higher than it used to be because of climate change. So these are the kinds of events that climate change is really throwing at us. Stronger storms that are causing more devastation in our communities. And on top of that, are more likely to coincide with other weather-related events like heat waves and cause additional strains on things like our electric grid, which have a lot of deferred maintenance and are in desperate need of upgrades. So whether it's Gulf Coast residents trying to rebuild their lives in the midst of power outages, or farmers in the Midwest losing crops due to unending rains and flooding, or farm workers in Florida showing signs of kidney injury because of repeated prolonged shifts of work in extreme heat, there's really nowhere one can go to escape the reality of our changed and changing climate.
Well, the overall news on COVID this week was positive, according to Public Health Officer Ryan Hutson in his testimony to the Board of Supervisors. The road ahead is far from clear. Hoffman said the worst surge of the pandemic is finally starting to ease, but he remains concerned that this most recent wave won't subside quite like our previous waves. He told the board that we may well experience a series of small surges as we make our way back to lower infection levels. Additionally, Hoffman told the board that this upcoming flu season may be worse than normal. Any lingering immunities may well have waned due to ongoing COVID response measures. Current COVID-19 case rates have dropped to the lowest rate they've been over the past 2 months. That being said, case rates remain higher than they were during the peak of any previous surges. Hoffman also pointed out that while COVID cases have been found among students, the county has thus far only seen one classroom outbreak. A month ago, we reported on the Texas law that had effectively nullified Roe versus Wade, and it made it almost impossible for women more than 6 weeks pregnant to get an abortion. That law, and others like it, contributed to the angst behind protests in Eureka and elsewhere this past weekend. KEET contributor Ryan Hutson was at the courthouse Saturday and filed this report.
Coordinated with protests coast to coast opposing the recent Texas abortion ban, which defies the legal precedent set by Roe v. Wade in 1973. Protesters supported reproductive freedoms, voicing opposition to the Texas law using terms like draconian and misogynistic. Planned Parenthood was on site tabling with free condoms and information. I spoke with Kathleen Marshall, who largely emceed the rally.
Is that correct?
Yes, they were here with a table. They handed out information, condoms, lubricant. Planned Parenthood is all about body positivity, reproductive rights, not just abortion rights.
All right, so if you had a moment privately with the Supreme Court justices, what would you say to them?
I would tell them that I am a 65-year-old woman who had a necessary abortion for an unwanted pregnancy in spite of using birth control at the age of 19. And that I feel every woman should be able to make the choice to have a safe and legal abortion based on the criteria that are most important to her.
Thank you.
As a result of the 1973 Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade, state laws that broadly deny abortions are deemed unconstitutional because they violate a person's 14th Amendment right to privacy. Moreover, the court concluded that valid government regulation of abortion takes place only after the first trimester, and that prior to that stage, denial of access to an abortion deprives citizens of fundamental liberties without due process of law. For Headline Humboldt, this is Ryan Hutson.
That's all our time for this evening. Stay tuned, stay informed.